There exists a dimension of human experience that most people never consciously enter, yet everyone has touched its edges in those liminal moments between waking and sleeping, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath. It is in these spaces that Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi mystic and philosopher, discovered something profound about the nature of prayer, consciousness, and the relationship between body and soul. He spoke of a state where the physical form surrenders to rest, yet something deeper within continues its sacred dialogue with existence itself. Consider for a moment the last time you fell asleep while your mind was preoccupied with something meaningful. Perhaps you were worried about someone you love, or contemplating a question that seemed to have no answer. You closed your eyes, your muscles relaxed, your breathing slowed, and consciousness began to fade. But did everything truly stop? Or did something within you continue working, processing, reaching towards something beyond the grasp of your waking mind? This is not merely about dreams, though dreams play their part in this mystery. This is about a state of being that transcends the ordinary categories we use to understand ourselves. We are taught to think of ourselves as either awake or asleep, conscious or unconscious, active or passive. But Ibn Arabi understood that reality operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and that the human being is far more complex than these simple binaries suggest. The body, with all its magnificent machinery of bones and blood, neurons and nerves, has its own intelligence and its own needs. It requires rest, restoration, the regular cycles of activity and recuperation that sustain biological life. When we sleep, cellular repair accelerates, memories consolidate, toxins are cleared from the brain. The body knows what it needs, and it takes what it requires without asking permission from our conscious will. This is the wisdom of matter, the intelligence embedded in flesh. But what of the spirit? What of that aspect of ourselves that seems to exist outside the rules governing physical matter? The spirit does not tire in the way the body tires. It does not require sleep in the conventional sense. In fact, when the body finally releases its grip on awareness, when the constant demands of sensory input and physical maintenance quiet down, the spirit may actually become more active, more alive, more attuned to dimensions of reality that are drowned out by the noise of daily life. Ibn Arabi wrote extensively about the night journey of the soul, drawing on Islamic mystical traditions, but also speaking to something universal in human experience. He described how the sleeping state opens doors that remain locked during waking consciousness. Not because sleep itself is superior to waking, but because the relaxation of the body's control creates space for other forms of knowing, other modes of connection to the divine reality that underlies all existence. Think about what happens when you finally stop trying. When you stop controlling, stop managing, stop orchestrating every detail of your life. When exhaustion or surrender or simple trust allows you to let go. In those moments, something else takes over. Not something alien or external, but something that was always there, always active, always working beneath the surface of your conscious mind. This is what Ibn Arabi meant when he spoke of the spirit that prays even when the body rests. Prayer in this context is not necessarily the recitation of words or the performance of rituals, though these have their place and purpose. Prayer here means something deeper and more fundamental, the orientation of consciousness toward truth, toward meaning, toward the source of being itself. It is the natural movement of awareness when it is freed from the prison of limited self-conception. The spirit prays the way a plant grows toward light, the way water flows downhill, the way a compass needle points north. It is not effort, but nature, not work, but being. Modern psychology has begun to rediscover what mystics like Ibn Arabi knew centuries ago. Research into sleep, dreaming, and altered states of consciousness reveals that the mind remains remarkably active during sleep, engaging in complex processing that is often more creative and integrative than waking thought. Problems that seemed unsolvable during the day sometimes resolve themselves overnight. Insights that eluded conscious analysis suddenly appear with clarity in the morning. The ancient advice to sleep on it reflects a deep wisdom about how consciousness actually works. But there is something even more subtle at play here, something that goes beyond cognitive processing or problem-solving. There is a quality of receptivity that becomes possible when the ego's defenses relax, when the constant stream of self-referential thoughts quiets down. In this receptive state, we become permeable to influences and insights that cannot penetrate the armor of the defended self. We become available to grace, to wisdom, to the subtle movements of what some call the divine and others might describe as the deeper intelligence of reality itself. Ibn Arabi spoke of the imagination as a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, and nowhere is this bridge more accessible than in the twilight states between sleeping and waking. The images that arise in dreams are not random firings of neurons, though they may involve neural activity. They are symbols, metaphors, communications from dimensions of the self that do not speak the language of logic and linear thought. Learning to read these symbols, to understand their messages, is part of what it means to recognize that the spirit continues its work when the body rests. Consider the experience of those who practice meditation or contemplative prayer. They often describe reaching states where the body becomes almost invisible, where physical sensations fade into the background and awareness expands into something vast and boundless. In these states, the distinction between self and other begins to blur. The sense of being a separate entity locked inside a physical form gives way to an experience of connection, of participation in something larger. This is not unconsciousness, but rather a different kind of consciousness, one that is usually obscured by the body's insistent demands. Yet even for those who do not formally practice meditation, this experience is available. It happens spontaneously in moments of deep absorption, when you are so engrossed in something that you lose track of time and self. It happens in moments of crisis, when the usual structures of thought collapse, and you find yourself acting from a deeper source of wisdom than your conscious mind. It happens in love, in art, in music, in the presence of natural beauty. It happens whenever the ordinary boundaries that define the separate self become permeable. The body resting while the spirit prays is not an exotic or rare state reserved for mystics and saints. It is a natural human capacity, though one that our culture often fails to recognize or value. We are so focused on productivity, on accomplishment, on the measurable outputs of conscious effort, that we overlook the importance of these other modes of being. We treat rest as merely the absence of activity, recuperation as simply preparation for more work. We miss the deeper truth that rest itself is a form of activity, a different kind of engagement with reality. Sleep is often seen as wasted time, hours lost to unconsciousness that could have been spent doing something useful. But what if sleep is not loss but gain? What if those hours contain their own form of usefulness, their own kind of productivity? Not the productivity of making or achieving, but the productivity of becoming, of transformation, of allowing something deeper within us to emerge and express itself. Ibn Arabi wrote about the concept of the perfect human, the complete person who has integrated all aspects of their being and become a mirror reflecting the divine attributes. This integration is not achieved through willpower alone, through conscious striving and self-improvement projects. It requires also a kind of surrender, a willingness to let go and allow processes beyond conscious control to unfold. The body must rest so that the spirit can do its work. The conscious mind must quiet so that the deeper intelligence can speak. There is a paradox here that runs through all spiritual traditions. The harder you try to achieve enlightenment or union with the divine, the more it eludes you. The more you grasp and strive and push, the further away your goal becomes. But when you finally give up, when you surrender and let go, when you stop trying to force anything to happen, then something shifts. Not because you have earned it through effort, but because you have finally cleared the space for it to emerge naturally. This is why practices of rest and receptivity are just as important as practices of discipline and effort. Meditation is not about forcing the mind to be quiet. It is about creating conditions where quietness can naturally arise. Prayer is not about manipulating the divine to grant your wishes. It is about opening yourself to be shaped by something larger than your individual desires. Sleep is not an interruption of spiritual life, but an essential part of it, a time when the work continues in ways that conscious effort cannot accomplish. Consider the phenomenon of incubation in creative work. Artists, writers, scientists, and inventors have long known that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to stop working on it. After struggling with a question or challenge during waking hours, they let it go, they rest, they sleep. And often the solution appears unbidden, arising from some depth they cannot name or control. This is not magic, but the natural operation of consciousness when it is freed from the limitations of narrow focus and deliberate control. The spirit that prays while the body rests is engaged in this kind of work. It is processing, integrating, reaching toward understanding in ways that transcend logical analysis. It is connecting disparate pieces of experience into meaningful patterns. It is healing wounds that conscious effort cannot touch. It is growing and developing according to its own internal logic, its own sense of direction and purpose. But this raises a question that may be troubling to some. If the spirit is active while we sleep, if prayer continues without our conscious participation, what does that say about free will and personal responsibility? Are we passive vessels for forces beyond our control, or are we active agents shaping our own destiny? Ibn Arabi would say that this question itself reflects a misunderstanding of how consciousness works. The relationship between conscious will and unconscious process is not one of opposition, but of collaboration. The conscious mind sets intention, directs attention, makes choices about what to focus on and what to ignore, but the deeper processes of transformation and integration operate beyond conscious control. They take the raw material that conscious experience provides and work with it in ways that serve the overall development of the person. Conscious and unconscious, body and spirit, effort and surrender, these are not enemies, but partners in the dance of becoming. This partnership requires trust. You must trust that when you let go, something reliable will catch you. You must trust that the processes working beneath conscious awareness are not random or chaotic, but intelligently ordered, moving toward wholeness and integration. This trust does not come easily in a culture that values control and mastery above all else. We are taught to be suspicious of anything we cannot directly manage and measure. We are encouraged to extend the reach of conscious will into every corner of life, to optimize and improve and perfect ourselves through deliberate effort. But there is a cost to this relentless focus on conscious control. When we try to manage everything, we exhaust ourselves and miss the gifts that come through surrender. When we refuse to rest deeply, we deprive ourselves of the transformation that happens in the dark. When we identify ourselves solely with the conscious ego, we cut ourselves off from the deeper sources of wisdom and creativity that dwell in the unconscious. The spirit that prays while the body rests is the part of us that knows this. It is the part that understands wordlessly and directly that we are more than our conscious thoughts and deliberate choices. It is the part that remains connected to the source even when our waking consciousness has wandered far from home. It is the part that never forgets what we essentially are, even when our ideas about ourselves become confused and contradictory. Ibn Arabi described various stations and states that the spiritual traveler passes through on the journey toward realization. Some of these states involve intense effort and discipline, deliberate practice and conscious development, but others involve the opposite: letting go, releasing, allowing. The wisdom of the path lies in knowing when to push forward and when to rest, when to act and when to receive, when to speak and when to listen to the silence. In the silence of deep rest, in the darkness of night when the world seems to pause, the spirit conducts its prayer. This prayer has no words, no prescribed form, no ritual structure. It is the pure orientation of consciousness toward its source, the natural movement of awareness returning to its ground. Like a river finding its way to the sea, like a child seeking its mother, like a compass needle swinging toward magnetic north, the spirit in its essential nature is always already praying, always already connected, always already home. The tragedy of ordinary life is not that we lack this connection, but that we fail to recognize it. We spend our days searching for something we already possess, striving to become something we already are. We exhaust ourselves with effort when what we need is rest. We fill our minds with noise when what we need is silence. We grasp and push and force when what we need is to surrender and receive. But even this tragedy contains within it the seed of transformation. The very exhaustion that comes from endless striving can become the gateway to surrender. The very noise that drowns out the quiet voice of spirit can become so overwhelming that we finally have to turn it off. The very grasping that keeps us separate can tire our hands until we have no choice but to open them and let go. This is what happens in the moment of falling asleep. The body finally overrides conscious will and demands its rest. All the projects and worries and plans that filled your waking mind begin to fade. The tight grip of ego loosens. The boundaries that seemed so solid become permeable. And in that moment of transition, in that liminal space between one state and another, there is a kind of death and rebirth. The person you were during the day dies away, and something else emerges, something more fluid and open, more connected to the depths. Ibn Arabi wrote that sleep is the brother of death, not because it is morbid or frightening, but because it involves a similar kind of letting go. Each night we practice dying to the limited self, releasing our grip on control, surrendering to processes beyond our management. And each morning we are reborn, returning to the world of form and activity, but hopefully carrying something of the depth we touched in the darkness. The person who understands this lives differently than the person who sees sleep as merely a necessary inconvenience. They approach rest with reverence, recognizing it as sacred time when important work happens. They do not resent the hours spent sleeping, but appreciate them as essential to wholeness. They trust that when they close their eyes and let go, they are not abandoning their spiritual life, but entering more deeply into it. This understanding changes how you prepare for sleep. Instead of collapsing into unconsciousness, with your mind still churning through the day's events, you might take time to transition consciously. You might sit in quiet for a few moments, acknowledging the day that has passed and releasing it. You might set an intention for your sleep, not controlling or demanding specific outcomes, but opening yourself to whatever wisdom wants to emerge. You might offer a simple prayer, not asking for things but expressing gratitude and trust, and then you let go. You release control. You allow the body to take over and do what it knows how to do. You trust that the spirit will continue its work without your supervision. You surrender to the darkness and the unknown, trusting that you will emerge renewed, that something essential will have been tended to, that the prayer you could not speak with words will have been voiced in the silence. This is not passivity but active receptivity. It is not giving up but giving over. It is not weakness but a different kind of strength, the strength to trust, to surrender, to allow. In a world that celebrates constant activity and control, this kind of strength is easily overlooked, but it is essential to wholeness, to integration, to becoming fully human. The great mystics understood that the spiritual path is not a straight line of constant progress, but a spiral of effort and rest, activity and receptivity, speaking and listening. You cannot sustain endless effort without burning out. You cannot maintain constant vigilance without exhausting yourself. You need rhythms, cycles, alternations between different modes of being. You need times when you push forward with discipline and intention, and times when you let go and allow deeper processes to unfold. The body's need for rest is not an obstacle to spiritual development, but an essential part of it. The hours spent sleeping are not hours stolen from your practice, but hours when practice continues in a different key. The darkness of night is not the absence of light, but a different kind of illumination, one that reveals what daylight cannot show. Ibn Arabi's insight that the spirit prays while the body rests points toward a radical trust in the intelligence of existence itself. It suggests that we do not have to manufacture connection to the divine through sheer force of will. The connection is already there, already operating, already doing its work. Our task is not to create it, but to recognize it, not to force it but to allow it, not to grasp it but to open ourselves to receive it. This recognition transforms everything. Work becomes less anxious when you trust that important processes continue even when you are not consciously working. Relationships become less strained when you trust that love operates at depths beyond conscious management. Life becomes less overwhelming when you trust that you do not have to control everything, that there is an intelligence at work larger than your individual will. But this trust must be earned through experience. You cannot simply decide to trust and have it be so. You must test it, verify it, discover through lived experience that it is reliable. You must pay attention to what happens when you let go. Notice what emerges from the depths when you stop forcing. You must learn to distinguish between true surrender and mere collapse, between healthy rest and avoidance, between genuine receptivity and passive resignation. This learning happens slowly through repeated cycles of effort and rest, control and release, activity and passivity. Each time you fall asleep, you have an opportunity to practice this surrender. Each time you wake, you can notice what gifts emerged from the darkness. Over time, a trust develops, a confidence that grows not from belief but from direct experience of how consciousness actually operates. The spirit that prays while the body rests is not separate from who you are. It is not some alien entity operating without your consent. It is the deepest part of yourself, the part that remains connected to Source, the part that knows its true nature even when your conscious mind has forgotten. Learning to recognize this part, to trust its operation, to cooperate with its work rather than obstruct it, this is a central task of the spiritual path. And yet, this part cannot be grasped or possessed. It cannot be controlled or managed by the conscious ego. It operates according to its own intelligence, its own timing, its own sense of what is needed. All you can do is create conditions that allow it to emerge and express itself. Rest is one of those conditions. Silence is another. Solitude, simplicity, spaciousness, these create the environment where the deeper self can speak. In the rushing complexity of modern life, these conditions are increasingly rare. We fill every moment with noise and activity. We fear silence and avoid it. We distract ourselves constantly from the still small voice that speaks only in quietness, and then we wonder why we feel disconnected, fragmented, lost. We have cut ourselves off from the very conditions that allow integration and wholeness to emerge. The practice of honoring rest as sacred time is a radical act of resistance against a culture that values only productivity and achievement. To deliberately create space for doing nothing, for letting go of control, for surrendering to processes beyond conscious management, this challenges the fundamental assumptions of a society built on conquest and mastery. But it is essential if we are to recover the wholeness that has been lost. Ibn Arabi lived in a very different world than ours, but his insight speaks across centuries because it addresses something fundamental about human nature. We are not merely conscious egos struggling to control ourselves and our environment. We are complex beings operating simultaneously on multiple levels, with dimensions of awareness and intelligence that transcend ordinary consciousness. Honoring all these dimensions, creating space for all aspects of ourselves to participate in life, this is what it means to become whole. The spirit that prays while the body rests is waiting for you to recognize it, to acknowledge its presence, to trust its work. It has always been there, always will be there, patiently continuing its prayer regardless of whether your conscious mind notices or appreciates it. But when you do begin to notice, when you do begin to appreciate and cooperate with this deeper intelligence, everything changes. You begin to live with less anxiety because you know that you are not solely responsible for making your life work. You begin to feel less fragmented because you recognize the continuity that exists beneath the surface fluctuations of mood and circumstance. You begin to experience more freedom because you are no longer imprisoned in the narrow cell of ego consciousness. You begin to know yourself as something larger, something connected to the whole, something participating in a dance that includes but vastly transcends your individual existence. This knowledge does not come through thinking or studying, though thought and study may prepare the ground for it. It comes through direct experience, through paying attention to what actually happens in the depths of your being. It comes through noticing what emerges when you stop forcing and allow. It comes through the humble willingness to acknowledge that you do not know everything, that there are dimensions of reality that exceed your conscious understanding. That mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. When you lie down to sleep tonight, you will once again have the opportunity to practice this surrender. Your conscious mind will gradually fade, your body will relax into rest, and something deeper within you will continue its work. The spirit will pray its wordless prayer, orienting itself toward truth the way a flower turns toward the sun. You do not have to make this happen. You do not have to understand or control it. You only have to allow it, to trust it, to recognize that even in the darkness and apparent unconsciousness of sleep, the essential work continues. This is the profound teaching that Ibn Arabi offers across the centuries. The body may rest, but the spirit never stops its prayer. Consciousness may fade, but awareness continues. The surface may become quiet, but the depths are always active, always alive, always engaged in the sacred work of returning to Source. Your task is not to create this reality, but to recognize it, not to force it, but to allow it, not to grasp it, but to surrender into it. In this surrender lies a freedom that no amount of control can provide. In this letting go lies a strength that no amount of grasping can achieve. In this trust lies a peace that passes all understanding, the peace that comes from knowing you are held by something larger than yourself, something that continues its work even when you sleep, something that has never abandoned you and never will. The night comes for everyone, the body demands its rest, the conscious mind must eventually release its grip. In those hours of darkness and apparent unconsciousness, the truest prayer is spoken, the deepest work is done, the most essential connection is maintained. And when morning comes, when you open your eyes and return to the world of form and activity, you carry something of that depth back with you, a reminder that you are more than you seem, that life operates on levels beyond conscious comprehension, that even in rest there is sacred activity, that even in surrender there is powerful engagement with the source of all being.